Welcome back. You're watching African Perspective, and as a precursor to a discussion we'll clearly have to have at another time, we look at corruption in Africa, on the continent, and its impact on development. Joining us to unpack, or at least touch on this subject, is Mthandazo Ndlovu, who's Governance and Democracy and Strategic Alliances Manager at Oxfam, South Africa, and Professor Simphiwe Sesanti, who is the Deputy Editor of African Renaissance Studies at Unisa. So as a broad springboard to whether or not we understand the extent of corruption in Africa, Prof, let me start with you. Looking at contemporary literature, is there consensus on the extent and even determining?
Well, there is a great literature that is dealing with the contemporary. And I think perhaps, there may be a problem with that, in the sense that if we simply look at the present without looking at the past and contextualizing, there is a serious disjuncture there. There needs to be, for us to be able to appreciate the present, we need to look at the historical past, because it is the tendencies and the actions or inactions of the past that have contributed majorly to the impasse that we find ourselves in now.
Mr. Ndlovu, when we're talking about the corruption index, and as I said, the actual corruption vis-a-vis the perception thereof, do we take into account historical corruption and how it impacts on modern day?
Perhaps not to a full extent, because the most modern nation states are founded on the legacies of corruption, be it the issues of land theft, and the architecture of the whole nation state is founded on a legacy of corruption. But of course, it's also further combated by the reality of unethical leadership that we have. Weakening state capacities, especially prosecuting authorities. Most of them are captured and are used in the interest of the elite and the politically connected across Africa. I mean, we have the Thabo Mbeki illicit financial flows report pointing to the reality and the fact that Africa loses over 50 billion per annum through illicit mechanisms.
So then let's come to that, Prof, because I want to, Mr. Ndlovu here is talking about land theft, for instance, and I know that's a huge problem on the continent. The legal codes that exist, are they not exacerbating the problem that we have, that in order to resolve some of these issues, we're using legal systems that were ostensibly created to pave the way for smooth corruption operations?
That's a very interesting question that you're raising, because when you examine the history of the struggles in the African continent, you will see that whether it be Zimbabwe, whether it be Ghana, whether it be South Africa, at all times when the masses had advanced their struggles and they were on the verge of defeating the enemy, at all times those who were on the other side, on their side, have always facilitated negotiations. And negotiations were arranged in such a way that they were going to benefit those that were benefiting already. And so the parameters were set already, and the rules of the game were determined by them. So you come from a legalistic environment that favored the oppressor, and you move again into an environment. Look at the case of Zimbabwe, for instance. We had Mutamara here. Just before independence in 1980, the leaders were taken to Lancaster House, and that is where, the decisions were made that the black people in Zimbabwe could vote until they become purple, but the economic power would continue to remain. And so when you examine literature, even within South Africa, there was a determination beforehand that whatever we would do, economic power would continue to be in the hands of those that held it. And so therefore, the kind of corruption that takes place is a corruption that had already been set, that at the basis it continues.
And I'd want to talk about the continuation. You talked about ethical leadership earlier on, Mr. Ndlovu, but I want to talk about effective institutions, because in some cases they say the institutions themselves determine social behavior. So if they themselves are not effective, how can you not then have corruption?
Well, I think we have to reimagine a new Africa. I mean, where ordinary people are then able to also engage and demand accountability from the political leaders, from the presidents, and even also from the private institutions. Because the reality of the matter is that corruption threatens stability. And of course, in most African contexts, we know, I mean, countries such as Somaliland, DRC, in the Great Lakes region, they are all conflict-ridden territories. This is all arising out of greed and corrupt practices by the political leaders. So I think we need to engage and mobilize citizens to be able to engage and claim and assert their rights. Whereas in the African context, we need to also perhaps start thinking about the African court and the SADC tribunal as well. Yeah.
Prof, just very quickly, the objective and subjective measures that we have in place to fight corruption, are they adequate?
Well, you know, we always, as Cabral would say, we begin from the position of our reality. And so, you know, we need to articulate a clear vision. But at the moment, my sense is that there is no coherent vision that is being articulated by the leadership and that is understood by the people that would enable the Africans to move to the destination that they are supposed to get to.
I'm going to have to thank you both very much. That there is Professor Simphiwe Sesanti, who is the Deputy Editor of African Renaissance Studies at Unisa, as well as Mthandazo Ndlovu Governance, Democracy and Strategic Alliances Manager at Oxfam South Africa. Thanks to you both
for
joining.